Commander Marcus Riley stood in the shadowed corner of the pre-operation briefing room, watching Lieutenant Sarah Chen through narrowed eyes as she methodically checked her medical kit for the third time that evening. Her movements were precise, economical, almost ritualistic in their perfection. Every bandage, every syringe, every specialized tool found its place in her gear with mechanical accuracy. The other operators of SEAL Team 7 lounged nearby, cracking jokes in low voices and testing equipment with the casual confidence of men who had done this 100 times before. But Chen remained isolated in her concentration, utterly focused, her jaw set in a way that suggested she was running through mental calculations and contingencies that no one else could perceive. Riley had fought this assignment with every ounce of political capital he possessed. He'd submitted formal objections to top command, citing operational protocols, team cohesion, and the unpredictable nature of high-altitude combat environments. A woman on his SEAL team. It violated everything he understood about how these units operated. The bonds formed in SEAL training were forged in adversity and shared suffering, the kind of crucible that traditionally had only admitted one gender. But top command had overruled him with bureaucratic finality, citing equal opportunity policies and combat effectiveness studies. They'd been dismissive of his concerns, treating his resistance as outdated bias rather than legitimate tactical consideration. So here he was, starring at this problem he'd been forced to accept. Yet as Riley observed Chen in the pre-operation staging area, something unexpected flickered through his perception. She moved with lethal precision, her body language betraying no uncertainty whatsoever. Every motion was purposeful, every decision was deliberate. There was no self-consciousness in how she conducted her preparations, no performative competence designed to impress the men watching her. She simply existed in her task, fully present in a way that suggested she'd been training for this moment her entire adult life. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her face lean and angular, her brown eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds, yet she moved with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what her body was capable of delivering. As if sensing his observation, Chen looked up from her medical kit and met Riley's gaze across the staging area. For a moment, they were connected by an invisible thread of recognition. Her eyes held no apology, no uncertainty, no plea for acceptance. They simply registered his presence and returned to her work. It was a gesture of complete professional competence, a quiet assertion that she belonged here and didn't require his permission or validation to prove it. Something in that moment shifted inside Riley's chest, a small fracture in the armor of his certainty. As the team began boarding the Black Hawk helicopter for insertion, Riley watched Chen move through the hold with absolute grace, securing her gear and taking her position in the tactical stack. She settled into her spot with the ease of someone who had practiced this insertion sequence hundreds of times. The rotor blades began their thunderous rotation, and the helicopter lifted off the tarmac, climbing into the Afghan night sky. Riley found himself sitting directly across from her, and in the dim red light of the cargo hold, he made a silent vow to himself. He'd give her a fair chance. Whatever his doubts, whatever his preconceptions, he would judge her on performance alone. But what Riley didn't realize was that Chen had already made her own vow, one far more demanding and infinitely more dangerous. She had committed to proving she belonged here, not through words or declarations, but through absolute and unwavering competence in the field. She understood that the men around her would be watching, assessing, waiting for any sign of weakness or hesitation. She understood that one mistake, one moment of doubt, could confirm every prejudice they harbored. And so she had hardened herself against fear, against pain, against any human weakness that might betray her resolve. As the helicopter descended toward the drop zone, Chen checked her rifle one final time, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across every surface and mechanism. She was ready, more than ready. She was Phantom, though the team didn't know that yet. They didn't know what that name meant or what it represented, But they would learn. They would all learn before this night was over exactly who sat among them in the darkness. The helicopter banked sharply, and Riley gripped the cargo net, preparing for insertion. Beside him, Chen sat perfectly still, breathing steadily, completely centered. Whatever happened next, he thought, this woman was going to change everything about how he understood his team, his mission, and himself. The Hindu Kush mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the starlit Afghan sky, their jagged peaks cutting silhouettes against the constellation-thick darkness. The Black Hawk helicopter descended into a narrow valley, its rotors creating a deafening symphony of mechanical thunder that echoed off the surrounding rock faces. Commander Riley's hand came up, and the team responded with practiced synchronization, each operator checking their equipment one final time, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles that transformed the world into a phosphorescent dreamscape of greens and blacks. The tension in the cargo hold was palpable, electric, the kind of pressure that only existed in those final moments before combat operations began. The fast rope was deployed and Riley went first, his gloved hands gripping the thick nylon cord as he rappelled out of the helicopter and into the darkness. The rope burned against his palms despite the protection, and the ground seemed to rush up impossibly fast. His boots hit the rocky terrain hard, and he immediately moved to the perimeter, weapon raised, eyes scanning for threats. Behind him came the rest of the team, each operator descending with practiced efficiency. The 19 men behind Riley moved like choreographed dancers, each understanding their role in the tactical formation without needing verbal instruction. And then came Chen, her slight frame belying the strength it took to control her descent on the rope. She landed with barely a sound, immediately moving to her assigned position with Cole watching her flanks. The helicopter banked away, its sound fading into the distance, leaving behind an almost suffocating silence broken only by the wind moving through the mountain passes. 20 SEALs were now scattered across the rocky terrain surrounding the Taliban compound, a sprawling collection of mud brick buildings and reinforced bunkers that squatted below them like some ancient predatory animal. Intelligence reports suggested the compound held between 40 and 60 fighters, but more importantly, it held a single high-value target, a Taliban logistics officer named Hakim Rashid, who was reportedly carrying detailed operational files about a coordinated attack planned against American targets on U.S. soil. The attack was scheduled for 3 weeks away. These files represented potential advance warning that could save dozens of American lives. Riley raised his hand, and the team began moving forward in a staggered formation down the mountainside toward the compound. Chen moved through the shadows like she'd been born in darkness, her rifle raised at a perfect ready position, her eyes sharp and alert behind her night vision goggles. She moved with none of the awkwardness or hesitation that Riley had half expected to see. Instead, she flowed across the rocky terrain with fluid grace, her breathing controlled, her awareness omnidirectional. She wasn't just watching her assigned sector. She was reading the entire tactical environment, processing threat indicators and terrain features simultaneously. The compound sprawled below them across roughly 2 acres, with the primary building, a 3-story structure reinforced with sandbags and makeshift barriers, positioned at the center. Smaller outbuildings radiated outward, connected by covered walkways and defensive positions. 2 guard towers rose at opposite corners, each manned by a single Taliban fighter who seemed bored, inattentive, unaware that death was descending upon them from the darkness. Riley signaled the team to halt 200 meters from the compound's outer wall, a crumbling structure made of ancient mud brick and rebar. They had 90 minutes before the Taliban changed guard shifts. 90 minutes to infiltrate, locate Rashid, secure the files, and extract before the compound's full complement of fighters cycled into position for the night watch. Chen took her position beside Master Chief Darius Cole, a 16-year veteran with a scarred face and the kind of weathered competence that came from too many combat deployments. He glanced at her with something between curiosity and assessment in his eyes. She nodded once, confirming she was ready, and they both turned their attention toward their assigned sector, the left flank of the compound where a covered walkway connected the main building to a smaller ammunition storage facility. No words passed between them, none needed. In the silence of the Afghan night, something clicked into place, a mutual recognition of competence, a tacit acknowledgement that they would either trust each other completely or die trying. As they descended toward the compound's outer wall, Riley caught Chen's eye one final time from his position 20 meters away. She was completely focused, completely present, her weapon held with professional precision. He nodded, just once. A simple gesture of acknowledgement and respect. It was enough. It was everything. And in that moment, as Chen nodded back and returned her attention to her sector, Riley understood that his doubts had been the barrier between them all along, not her capability, but his willingness to see it. The compound exploded into gunfire without any warning whatsoever, transforming the quiet Afghan night into a hellscape of muzzle flashes and incoming rounds. One moment there was silence, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that preceded combat operations, and the next moment the world became pure chaos, pure violence, pure noise. Taliban fighters materialized from hidden positions throughout the compound like phantoms summoned from darkness itself, their AK-47 spitting fire in sustained bursts that sent rounds screaming through the night air. The muzzle flashes illuminated the terrain in stroboscopic patterns, creating a disorienting visual environment where shadows and light warred against each other in deadly competition. Riley's voice crackled through the radio with absolute calm, steady and commanding despite the hellstorm erupting around them. Contact left and center. Return fire. Bravo team move to secondary position. Charlie team suppress the North Tower. His instructions came with the precision of a man who had trained for this moment his entire professional life. A commander who understood that his team's survival depended on his ability to remain absolutely composed even as incoming fire passed close enough to singe hair. The SEALs responded instantly, weapons barking in controlled bursts, targeting the Taliban fighters with methodical accuracy. They had trained together for months, running scenarios and practicing coordinated responses until the movements became second nature, muscle memory overriding fear. Chen's training took over completely, and in that transition she became something other than herself. She became motion and instinct, became pure tactical function, became the operator that months of preparation had shaped her into. She moved through her designated sector with textbook precision, her rifle raised at the ready position, her eyes tracking through windows and doorways looking for additional threats. Her movements were economical and efficient, no wasted motion, no hesitation. She cleared corners using proper tactical technique, weapon raised, eyes leading her hands, body positioned to minimize exposure. All the while, she maintained awareness of Cole's position beside her, keeping track of his movements and providing mutual support and coverage. A round suddenly caught Cole in the right shoulder, punching through his body armor with penetrating force, and then into the muscle beneath with devastating kinetic energy. The impact spun him backward, his weapon dropping slightly, his body momentarily compromised by shock and pain. He went down hard against the rocky ground, gasping involuntarily, his breath torn from him by the trauma of impact. But Chen was there in 2 seconds flat, moving without conscious deliberation, her medical training and combat instinct perfectly synchronized. She grabbed Cole under his left arm and dragged him behind a concrete wall that provided temporary shelter from the incoming fire. She didn't hesitate, didn't assess whether the risk was worth taking, didn't question her own ability to execute the movement under fire. She simply acted, propelled by the kind of commitment that transcended fear or self-preservation. Once they were behind the wall, Chen transitioned fluidly from medic to combatant. She drew her sidearm, a Sig Sauer P2 26 9mm pistol, and began returning fire at the muzzle flashes she could see from the compound's northern position. Her shots were precise and controlled, each round fired with deliberate intent, each burst designed to suppress enemy fire rather than necessarily to kill. She was maintaining tactical awareness on multiple levels, suppressing the enemy with her sidearm while simultaneously assessing Cole's wound, determining whether he could continue operating or whether he needed immediate medical intervention. Riley watched from his position 30 meters away, and in that moment of watching Chen operate under fire, something fundamental shifted inside him. The doubts that had plagued him since her assignment to the team evaporated like morning mist. This wasn't a woman trying to prove herself to a group of skeptical men. This wasn't someone compensating for perceived deficiency with aggressive displays of competence. This was an operator, pure, lethal, and absolutely committed to the mission and to protecting her teammates. She moved with the kind of instinctive grace that only came from thousands of hours of training, from a mind that had been shaped and hardened through adversity into something approaching perfection. The enemy fire intensified dramatically, rounds now striking the concrete wall with such frequency that dust clouds erupted from each impact. The Taliban fighters were concentrating their fire on Riley's position and Chen's position, recognizing these as command and control nodes. Riley understood immediately that they couldn't sustain this engagement. They were pinned down with no immediate avenue for movement, and ammunition, even for SEALs, was a finite resource. He made a split-second decision that would echo through the rest of his life, a choice that would define not only this mission, but everything that came after. Commander Marcus Riley crouched behind a reinforced sandbag position, his mind operating at the crystalline level of clarity that only emerged under extreme combat stress. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. They had sustained contact for approximately 4 minutes, and while SEAL Team 7 was inflicting significant casualties on the Taliban fighters, the enemy had achieved something that shouldn't have been possible. They had achieved numerical parity through reinforcements arriving from outlying positions. What was supposed to be a straightforward extraction operation had transformed into a sustained firefight that threatened to compromise the entire mission objective. Riley's tactical map of the compound was encoded in his mind through months of reconnaissance and intelligence briefings. He understood every structure, every covered position, every potential avenue of approach and escape. The intelligence officer, a mid-level Taliban logistics coordinator named Hakim Rashid, was located in the main building's eastern wing, second floor, in what had been designated as the operations center. Retrieving him required pushing deeper into the compound, which meant maintaining suppressive fire from multiple positions simultaneously. But the team's ammunition supply, while substantial, was not infinite. At the current rate of engagement, they had perhaps 8 more minutes of sustained firefight capacity before they'd be forced to transition to secondary weapons and hand-to-hand combat, a prospect that dramatically reduced their chances of successful extraction. The fundamental problem was tactical depth. They needed to simultaneously hold their current position to suppress the enemy, push forward to retrieve Rashid, and maintain a clear extraction corridor to the landing zone 200 meters to the south. With only 20 operators, that mathematical equation didn't resolve favorably. Riley ran through the calculations in his mind, processing variables and possibilities at extraordinary speed. Then he understood what needed to happen. It was a decision that violated every protocol, that ran counter to years of training, that risked everything he'd worked for. But it was the only decision that gave the mission a probability of success exceeding 50%. Chen, Cole, and the asset moved to extraction point, Riley commanded through the radio, his voice steady and authoritative despite the momentous nature of what he was instructing. Now, go. There was a microsecond of silence, an almost imperceptible pause that suggested Chen was processing the implications of that order. Then came her response, transmitted with absolute professionalism. Copy. But those 2 syllables carried weight that transcended their literal meaning. She understood what Riley was really communicating. He was staying behind. The core of the team would hold this position and maintain suppressive fire while she extracted Cole and the intelligence officer to safety. It violated protocol. It risked command structure. It meant trusting her with a responsibility that typically fell to senior enlisted personnel. And it meant Riley believed Chen could do it. Chen immediately transitioned from combat suppression mode to medic mode, though she never truly abandoned her tactical awareness. She ran her assessment of Cole's shoulder wound with clinical precision, her hands moving with practiced confidence despite the rounds still impacting around them. The fibula hadn't been struck. That was fortunate. The shoulder wound was significant but not immediately life-threatening as long as bleeding could be controlled. She found the pressure points, applied a combat tourniquet with practiced efficiency, and injected Cole with morphine using an auto-injector. His eyes began to glaze slightly as the medication took effect, but consciousness remained, critical for maintaining mobility. The intelligence officer, a terrified Afghan translator named Masood who had been providing real-time information to the SEAL team, crouched behind Chen with visible fear etched across his features. He was unarmed, untrained for combat, and completely dependent on the operators surrounding him for survival. Chen looked at him with eyes that conveyed absolute competence. "Stay behind me," she said in heavily accented Pashto. "Stay low. Do not look back. We move now or we die now. Understand?" Masood nodded frantically, understanding the stakes with crystalline clarity. Chen wrapped Cole's arm around her shoulders, taking as much of his weight as she could while maintaining her rifle in operational position. The alley that led out of the compound stretched before them like a dark tunnel, approximately 120 meters of open ground with minimal cover. Enemy fire was still chasing them, rounds cracking overhead and sparking off concrete surfaces with violent percussion. Chen moved at a controlled pace, fast enough to close distance toward safety, deliberate enough to maintain balance and tactical awareness. She was calculating angles, distances, and timing with the precision of someone whose training had become reflex. Chen's left foot caught on a jagged piece of concrete rubble that protruded unexpectedly from the ground, a hidden hazard that materialized without warning in the darkness. The stumble happened in slow motion, or at least that's how her traumatized nervous system would process it in the aftermath. Her body pitched forward involuntarily, her weight shifting from controlled movement to sudden instability. Her left leg twisted violently beneath her, the fibula and tibia rotating in directions nature had never intended. The pain that exploded through her lower leg was astronomical, world-ending, the kind of agony that made her vision blur and her breath catch in her throat. She felt the break distinctly, a sensation like a dry branch snapping, accompanied by a grinding sensation deep within the bone itself. Her brain screamed warnings in 1,000 different languages, demanding that she stop, that she rest, that she surrender to the injury's demands. But they were still exposed in the open alley, approximately 100 meters from the compound's outer perimeter. Behind them, Taliban fighters continued to pour fire in their direction, their bullets sparking off walls and concrete with deadly precision. Surrender to the injury was surrender to death. Stopping meant Cole died from blood loss. Stopping meant Masood died. Stopping meant the intelligence files, the files that could save dozens of American lives, remained in Taliban possession. Chen locked the pain away in some compartment of her mind that she'd been building her entire life, a psychological vault reserved specifically for suffering that demanded postponement. Survival now, suffering later. That was the equation that governed her actions in this moment. She forced herself upright, using Cole's shoulder as leverage, her jaw clenching so hard she thought her teeth might crack under the pressure. Pain radiated through her shin in waves, each step sending lightning bolts through the injury, each movement threatening to compromise her balance. But she wrapped the leg tightly with a field dressing from her medical kit, her hands moving with automatic competence despite the agony coursing through her body. The dressing wouldn't heal anything. It was merely compression, merely containment, merely a psychological gesture toward maintaining structural integrity. But it helped, marginally, Barely, but it helped. Cole tried to take more of his own weight, understanding at some level that Chen was compromised by injury, but his body wasn't cooperating. The morphine had made him loose, compliant, but also weak. His shoulder was screaming in agony despite the medication, and his blood loss had rendered him dangerously pale. He could barely maintain consciousness, let alone provide meaningful support. Masood, the intelligence officer, looked at Chen with something between terror and amazement, witnessing a human being operate through what should have been incapacitating trauma. "We move," Chen said through gritted teeth, her voice sounding like it emerged from somewhere deep within her chest. "We move or we die. No other options." And they moved. Every step was torture. Her shin felt like splintering glass, like bones grinding relentlessly against bone, like something fundamentally broken at the cellular level attempting to continue performing functions. It no longer possessed the structural integrity to support. But she maintained her pace, maintained her silence about the injury's severity, maintained her focus on the extraction objective. Behind them, Riley's suppressive fire kept the enemy's heads down, his voice crackling through the radio with coordinates and target callouts, keeping the team coordinated and organized despite the chaos erupting around them. She could hear his distinctive cadence, calm, authoritative, unyielding. The extraction point grew closer with agonizing slowness. 100 meters separated them from salvation, then 90, then 80. The rhythm of helicopter rotors became audible, that beautiful mechanical percussion that represented rescue and deliverance and the possibility of surviving this night. The Black Hawk's approach was like a benediction from above, a promise that they might actually achieve their objective. But they weren't safe yet, not until they were airborne. Not until altitude and distance separated them from the Taliban's effective fire range. Chen pushed harder despite the screaming in her leg, despite the nausea threatening to overcome her, despite every instinct demanding that she stop and rest. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on the landing zone ahead, on the open ramp of the Black Hawk that seemed to grow larger with each limping step. Cole was barely conscious, his body a dead weight that she was practically carrying alone. Masood stayed close, his eyes wide with shock and awe at witnessing human determination expressed at its absolute extreme. 20 meters, 10 meters. The landing zone rushed toward them with final acceleration. The Black Hawk's landing lights cut through the Afghan darkness like twin pillars of divine intervention, illuminating the rocky terrain in harsh white brilliance that made Chen's eyes water behind her night vision goggles. The helicopter descended with practiced precision, its pilots having executed this maneuver hundreds of times across multiple deployments. The landing gear touched down with barely a tremor, and the ramp immediately began lowering, creating a metal pathway between the aircraft and the ground. Chen could feel the rotor wash now, a tremendous downward pressure that threatened to knock her off balance, but she drove forward with absolute determination, practically dragging Cole towards salvation. Strong hands appeared at the ramp's edge, members of the extraction team who had been briefed on incoming wounded. They saw Chen's strained expression, understood instantly that something was critically wrong and rushed forward to meet her. One operator, a massive staff sergeant named Williams, practically scooped Cole into his arms and hauled him toward the helicopter's interior. Another operator, equally large and equally competent, reached for Chen to provide support. But Chen tried to follow under her own power, refusing assistance with a shake of her head that suggested she believed she could still maintain independent mobility. Her left leg gave out completely as she attempted to climb onto the ramp. The collapse happened with devastating abruptness. Her injured leg simply stopped functioning, refused to support weight, buckled beneath her with finality. She fell forward onto the metal platform of the ramp with jarring impact, the pain of the landing amplifying the injury by orders of magnitude. For the first time since the initial break, a sound escaped her, not a scream, not a sob, but something between a gasp and a grunt. an involuntary vocalization of suffering that she couldn't suppress despite her iron discipline. Strong hands grabbed her immediately, multiple operators working in coordinated efficiency to pull her into the helicopter's interior. The ramp began raising before her body had fully cleared the ground, and the helicopter surged upward with aggressive acceleration, climbing away from the compound, away from the enemy fire, away from the nightmare that had unfolded across the past 20 minutes. Army Flight Medic Rodriguez, a veteran non-commissioned officer with the bearing of someone who had seen more combat wounds than most surgeons, knelt beside Chen with practiced efficiency. His assessment was systematic and rapid. He'd been trained to evaluate multiple casualties simultaneously and triage based on severity. Cole's shoulder was bleeding but stable, the tourniquet holding, the morphine keeping him conscious but sedated. Chen's leg was a different story entirely. Rodriguez cut away her pant leg with medical shears, and the moment the fabric cleared, he winced involuntarily. The fibula was clearly fractured, the fracture line visible as a grotesque deformity in her lower leg. The surrounding tissue was swollen to grotesque proportions, already turning deep purple and black from internal bleeding and tissue trauma. Significant soft tissue damage suggested the bone had potentially penetrated the skin at the moment of initial break, creating what could potentially develop into an open fracture with infection risk. "We need to get you on morphine immediately," Rodriguez said, reaching into his medical pack with urgency. His hands moved toward an auto-injector, understanding that pain management was critical for shock prevention. But Chen's hand shot out with surprising strength, her fingers wrapping around his wrist with an iron grip that belied her slight frame and her obvious distress. "Not yet," she rasped, her voice raw and breathless from pain and exertion. "I need my head clear. Get Cole stable first." Rodriguez hesitated, his medic's instinct warring with her explicit instructions. In trauma medicine, pain management was considered essential for preventing shock-induced mortality. But he also recognized the look in her eyes, the absolute determination of someone operating on will alone, refusing to surrender consciousness or mental clarity until her mission was completely secured. He'd seen that look before on other operators, that particular expression of commitment that transcended normal human limitation. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, acknowledging her authority despite her junior rank. He turned his full attention to Cole, establishing IV access, administering additional blood-clotting agents, ensuring the Master Chief's immediate survival. Behind them, the helicopter screamed toward the forward operating base, its rotors cutting through the night air with mechanical precision. Chen stared out into the darkness beyond the open cargo doors, her jaw clenched so hard that her facial muscles trembled with tension. Her leg throbbed with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat, each pulse sending fresh waves of agony cascading through her lower extremity. But her mind remained sharp, focused, calculating. The mission wasn't over. Not yet. Not until she delivered her report, ensured that Cole was truly stable, confirmed that Masood and the intelligence files were secure. Only then could she permit herself the luxury of unconsciousness. The forward operating base materialized out of the darkness like a constellation of electric lights. The runway, the perimeter security lights, the distant glow from the operations buildings. The Black Hawk descended with practiced precision, its pilots executing a textbook approach that spoke to thousands of hours of similar landings across multiple combat deployments. Medical personnel were already standing by on the tarmac, having received notification of incoming casualties during the helicopter's transit from the compound. They wheeled gurneys with urgent purpose, understanding from the radio traffic that they had one critical shoulder wound and one potential orthopedic emergency requiring immediate surgical intervention. The helicopter's rotors continued their rhythmic percussion as the ramp lowered, revealing the interior where combat-stressed SEALs and their wounded moved with practiced efficiency. Cole was transferred to a gurney first, his shoulder wound receiving immediate attention from trauma nurses who cut away additional fabric and began establishing additional IV access. Chen remained seated on the deck of the helicopter, her injured leg extended before her, refusing assistance with a subtle shake of her head that suggested she could manage independent transfer. But when the medical personnel attempted to help her onto a gurney, her injured leg simply didn't cooperate. The fibula's break had worsened during the flight, and her body was beginning to enter early shock despite her remarkable mental fortitude. Inside the forward operating base's medical facility, the chaotic energy of a combat operation filled every space. Medics moved with urgent purpose between treatment stations. Doctors reviewed incoming casualty reports and prepared surgical suites for emergency procedures. The intelligence officer, Masood, was quickly separated from the medical flow and escorted to a secure briefing room where intelligence specialists waited with eager intensity. They understood the value of the files he'd been carrying. Riley completed his initial mission report while simultaneously coordinating with command authority, filling out casualty assessments and mission success documentation with the efficiency of someone who had executed hundreds of similar reports. 2 wounded, 0 KIA, a tactical victory, the intelligence secured, the objective achieved. By every measurable standard, the operation had succeeded brilliantly. But as Chen was being transferred to the field hospital's surgical wing for proper evaluation and treatment, the base's chief medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Graves, a career Navy physician with the bearing of someone who had seen more combat casualties than most surgeons, approached Riley with a peculiar expression etched across his weathered face. Graves was 53 years old, with gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that came from decades of operating in austere medical environments. His eyes carried the weight of thousands of trauma cases, but something about Chen's presentation had triggered a question that extended beyond pure medical necessity. "Sir, I need to verify something for the medical record," Graves said, his voice carrying the formal precision of military protocol. "When Chen was checked in at triage, we ran her vitals and conducted a preliminary assessment. The trauma surgeon is going to want to know her military code name for the operative report. It's standard procedure for operator records, helps with classification and documentation in our classified casualty tracking system." Riley turned from his paperwork, understanding the significance of the question even before comprehending its literal meaning. A code name wasn't merely administrative designation. In the SEAL community, a code name was sacred. It represented something fundamental about an operator's essence. The warrior they became when bullets started flying and survival depended on something beyond normal human limitation. Riley walked over to the gurney where Chen lay, her injured leg immobilized in a temporary splint, her body beginning to finally acknowledge the trauma it had sustained across the previous hours. Her eyes remained sharp and present despite the morphine that Rodriguez had finally administered during the helicopter transit. The entire team had followed Riley, an unspoken understanding that this moment mattered, that whatever came next would define something essential about their collective understanding of who Chen was and what her presence meant to their unit. Graves posed the question with appropriate gravity, his voice carrying the weight of institutional protocol. "Lieutenant Chen, what's your operational code name?" The silence that followed was suffocating in its intensity. None of the assembled operators had ever asked that question during their months of training together. Through briefings and operations, through shared meals and equipment checks, through the quotidian reality of military service, nobody had thought to pose that fundamental query. In SEAL culture, code names were awarded through implicit recognition. They emerged from the warrior's essential nature, from how that person operated under pressure, from the tactical signature they left on the battlefield. Chen looked directly at Riley, then at each of the team members gathered around the medical gurney. Her broken leg throbbed beneath the temporary splint with a rhythm that seemed to pulse in synchronization with her heartbeat. Her body screamed with exhaustion and pain, with injury and shock, with the accumulated trauma of a night that had pushed human endurance to its absolute extremes. But her eyes remained absolutely clear, absolutely present, absolutely focused. "Phantom," Chen said quietly, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper despite the absolute clarity with which she pronounced the word. The name seemed to hang suspended in the fluorescent-lit medical bay, illuminated by the harsh clinical lighting of the forward operating base's surgical facility. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The word existed in the space between them like a revelation, like a fundamental truth that had always existed beneath the surface, but remained unspoken until this precise instant of recognition. The team members exchanged glances, rapid, meaningful looks that conveyed entire conversations without requiring verbal articulation. Nobody had known. Nobody had predicted what that designation would be. Nobody had anticipated that the woman who had fought so hard to earn her place on this team would carry such a name that suggested invisibility, presence without acknowledgement, the capacity to move through spaces undetected by those not trained to perceive. In SEAL culture, code names were sacred artifacts that transcended mere designation. They represented the warrior beneath the uniform, the operator when the shooting started, the essential nature of how that person functioned in combat environments where survival depended on something beyond standard human capacity. Graves made meticulous notes on his tablet, his clinical demeanor acknowledging the significance of what he just documented. "Phantom," he repeated, his voice carrying respect. "I'll make sure that's properly recorded in your operative file." He nodded respectfully and stepped back, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to the team rather than to medical personnel. Riley felt something break open inside his chest, a fundamental fracture in his previous certainty, a devastating recognition of how fundamentally wrong he'd been about the woman lying before him. She hadn't been a woman trying to prove herself to a group of skeptical men. She had never been that person. She had been Phantom all along, an operator of exceptional competence executing her mission with absolute commitment. He'd brought her into this team with doubts, watched her with reservations, tested her competence mentally even as she passed every physical evaluation with distinguished performance. He'd questioned her presence, questioned her capability, questioned whether she truly belonged in spaces traditionally reserved for men. And then, out there on that mountain, with her legs shattering beneath her in the darkness, she hadn't been a woman attempting to prove her worth. She had simply been Phantom, executing her responsibilities with unwavering commitment, protecting her teammates with absolute dedication, walking on a broken leg through fire and darkness, without allowing pain or injury to compromise her mission focus. The surgical team prepared to wheel Chen toward the operating room, where orthopedic specialists would address the fractured fibula and the extensive soft tissue damage that had accumulated during her desperate extraction of coal and massud. As they began moving the gurney, Chen caught Riley's eye one final time across the medical bay. That single glance communicated what words could never adequately convey, a message that transcended language and protocol and military hierarchy. "I was always here. You just finally learned to see me. I was always Phantom. You just needed to witness what that meant in action." The silence that followed wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't doubt or uncertainty or the weight of unresolved questions. It was respect, pure, complete, earned not through declarations or political mandates but through blood and broken bones, an unwavering commitment to mission and teammates. Phantom had arrived, not as a presence that needed to be accommodated or tolerated or accepted through institutional policy. She had arrived as what she'd always been, an operator of exceptional capability whose gender was irrelevant compared to her competence and her dedication. 6 weeks later, Chen would stand in the operations briefing room with a slight limp that physical therapy would continue addressing for months. The fracture would heal cleanly, though the soft tissue damage would require ongoing rehabilitation and careful management. Riley stood at the front of the room, addressing the team before their next rotation deployment. Phantom earned her place here, he said without preamble, without the usual ceremonial language that typically accompanied such statements. Not because she's a woman, not because she had to prove something. She earned it because she's one of the finest operators I've ever had the privilege to command. The team sat in absolute silence, the weight of those words settling over them like benediction. They'd all seen it on that mountain. They'd all felt the shift in their collective understanding. They'd all witnessed what Phantom was truly capable of when the shooting started and survival depended on something beyond normal human limitation. Chen nodded slightly, accepting the acknowledgement without requiring fanfare or additional validation. Because that was the thing about Phantom, she never needed the words.